Hey, hi guys. My name is Sydney Pitborick, and today I'm going to be talking about climate change, environmental degradation, uh, and sustainability, and kind of what that means in agriculture and how we produce our food. So I'll go into just like a little bit of an intro. So worldwide environmental conditions have changed more rapidly in the past half century than at any other time in human history. And when looking at modern agriculture, it doesn't take much to realize just how influential it is on some of the most threatening global environmental issues that we're currently facing. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. So the first thing I'm going to go into is climate change. So kind of what that is, climate change and environmental degradation, and how climate change is impacting our food sources and food production. So climate change will have a progressively increasing impact on environmental degradation and environmentally dependent socioeconomic systems, with the potential to cause substantial population displacement as well. So from climate change, we're seeing radical changes in temperature with no real pattern, which is making it increasingly difficult for agriculture to survive. An article from Progress in Natural Science actually states that global food security threatened by climate change is one of the most important challenges in the 21st century to supply sufficient food for the increasing population while sustaining the already stressed environment. So, kind of what that's saying is climate change is inadvertently taking away our food sources. And the reason for that is these rapid changes in temperature are coming so quickly that crops can't survive. So we're seeing agriculture start failing, and we're seeing lower and lower yields because of these changes in temperature and changes in climate in several places. And this is actually seen, climate change has already caused significant impacts on water resources, food security, hydropower, and human health even. And you can really see this in less developed countries, specifically in sub-Saharan Africa is a really good example of this. You're seeing really, really warm climates, lack of fresh water because of this, no real food security because they can't grow crops. And there's tons of, and especially in the sub-Saharan region where it's all desert, like they can't, we talked about this a lot in the soil unit, but you can't grow crops in dust. So we're really kind of seeing that in LDCs. And especially in recent years, more and more attention has been paid to the risks associated with climate change, which will increase uncertainty with respect to food production. So water availability is also going to be one of the most limiting constraints for crop production and food security, and that's kind of the biggest issue that we're facing with climate change. So we've already seen a lot of these restraints on food production, as I said, in the third world or LDCs, which is just kind of, it goes to show. So kind of what we're looking at. And this is really only getting worse with the impending threat of climate change, because this type of environment, this sub-Saharan Africa, for example, environment, this desert, is just getting worse with climate change because it's spreading and becoming more common. And as we talked about in Module 7 with soil, when soil becomes desert, it's impossible to go back to being the nutrient-rich soil that can grow crops and be used in agriculture. So with these types of climates becoming more and more common with climate change, we'll have to rely solely on crops such as wheat, maize, and beans to sustain us as a society. So these are considered kind of dry crops. So future generations will in turn suffer the consequences and most of the harmful effects of global climate change. This isn't an issue that we're dealing with currently. This is us being proactive, and like we need to proactively, I guess, kind of look at climate change and look at the harmful effects and be aware of that, because it's not going to be our problem, so to speak. Like we won't face the consequences, but future generations will. So, and that's sort of kind of an ethical issue as well, because we have to decide what's more important, us or future generations. So if the world economy grows, the lower generations will be richer than we are. So it's kind of become the responsibility of the present generation, so millennials and Gen Z, to decide whether to aggressively reduce the chances of future harm or to let our descendants, so kind of future generations, basically fend for themselves in this way. This becomes an ethical conversation because we're essentially deciding right now whose problem it is, climate change that is. So kind of the question that we're faced with is, are we placing more value on our current lives than the lives of future generations? Are we being selfish as a society by not taking more active steps to slow climate change and protect our environment? And those are kind of questions that we all have to ask ourselves. And later on, I'll kind of give my point of view and my answers to those. Um, and then we'll also kind of talk about just industrial farming versus sustainable farming. So industrial farming inevitably causes continuous erosion and nutrient depletion of soil. Sustainable farms use minimal pesticides to ensure protection of their soil, crops, and general environment of their farm. But with industrial farming, chemicals are used to protect crops and animals, but the use of these chemicals has been proven to have adverse effects on our health. So, though sustainable farming is overall better for the environment and our health, it can be quite expensive and difficult to implement at first. Kind of changing the entire agricultural system can't just happen overnight. So, that's sort of something that we're really dealing with. Is you can't just change, a system that's been in place since the beginning of time in one day. So I guess really what we're faced with and what the best next steps are going to be is the government and the world governments, I suppose, need to make it worthwhile for farmers to kind of make these changes and transition into sustainable agriculture versus keeping the industrial farming system that's currently in place. So next I'm going to talk more about sustainability and specifically sustainability in food production and agriculture. So I'll kind of just go into that. So our current food industry is extremely unsustainable, and that you can't argue that. It's wasteful, it's inefficient, and it's just unsustainable in general. So kind of an example of this is to produce 1 kilogram of meat, we use the amount of water one person needs for an entire year. 70% of land that used to be rainforest is now used for animal production. And as far as greenhouse gases, CO2 and methane emissions are higher from agriculture, even than the transportation industry, which we all know the transportation industry creates huge amounts of emission, and agriculture actually exceeds that amount. So honestly, just the careless extraction, depletion, and exploitation of natural resources have become the fuel to grow our food supply. Our practices have devastating implications, for soil erosion, deforestation, climate change, and this kind of all just leads to global health in general. So the cause of these environmental issues is a deadly trifecta. So for example, like tilling of soil, which we talked about, monocultural productions, which we talked about, and the use of chemical pesticides, herbicides, and fertilizers. So consequently, our actions are having a devastating impact on the health of our environment and our bodies. And I'll go into a little bit about each of these things that I mentioned. So soil tilling, for example, we already kind of talked about it in past modules. But soil tilling is incredibly harmful to the environment, and it's very common in modern agriculture. So when we turn the soil, we break the complex structures and biological interactions that soil life works to create. So by doing it, an excess of oxygen is introduced into the soil, causing increased decomposition of organic material, which quickly floods the soil with nutrients, which is why we do it. So it kind of increases crop yield immediately. But then after that, the natural processes are kind of interrupted. So then the soil can't go back to its normal rate of everything. And then it actually kind of depletes the organic material much more quickly, and the soil gets ruined in turn at a much quicker rate. So kind of by tilling soil, we're almost taking away the nutrients at twice the speed. So kind of what this means just for the average consumer and for us in our food production is the plants you eat may be malnourished and produced in a way that's harmful to the environment. So this includes organic plants too. Plants grown the conventional way in an unhealthy soil lack the same vitamins and nutrients as ones grown in healthy soil. So the more that we till the soil, we're kind of taking nutrients away. So in turn, the crops that are being produced in this soil aren't as nutritious as really they are supposed to be. And this is kind of just a domino effect, because as we continue to till the soil and do this, kind of all of our food is starting to lose its nutrients and lose its health, I guess like the healthy additives that we need. So kind of even though you're eating healthy, how healthy are you eating? It might not be as effective as you might think. So I'm going to talk about monocropping and monoculture as well. So basically just when a single type of crop is cultivated in large numbers in close proximity, that's sort of what monocropping is, or monoculture. But it actually increases the likelihood for insect or disease infestation in the plants, which typically does result in mass crop failure. So, kind of what this means to us as consumers is it creates an environment that's susceptible to disease and pest infestation, including drought as well. So, in times of drought, such as in 2014, there was the big drought in California, prices rise as crops fail and demand overtakes supply. So basically, crops are getting way more expensive for the same thing. And actually, according to an article in Science Daily, in LDCs or less developed countries, drought, disease, and pest infestation can mean more than just a higher cost. Where in the U.S. we can see the prices change obviously in drought, but for them or those in poverty in general, crop failure can lead to inescapable famine, death, disease. It can change everything because if they don't get the crops that they need, it means everything to them. So, in order to have healthy, reliable, and secure food production throughout the world, we will have to evolve our production of food and beyond monoculture. And so, then kind of chemical use. So, obviously, chemical use in pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, fertilizers, those kinds of things, obviously they have been proven to have negative or adverse impacts on human health, but they also have adverse effects on the entire earth, like on our environment in general. So, for example, it kind of creates dead zones. So, a dead zone is an example of a collapsed aquatic ecosystem resulting in the death of aquatic animal life in an area, which I got that from the Sustainability Project. So once we deplete soils of their natural nutrition, we apply fertilizers to replenish it and support the growth of plants. In addition to that, these keep out pests and insects. But as we do that, when we apply these fertilizers, it temporarily supplies like a growth to plants and kind of kickstarts that, but it's all artificial. So it's not the plant growing on its own. And then we talked about this a lot when we talked about Roundup Ready soybeans and things like that. Plants are getting reliable on these. So they're becoming reliant and they can't grow without it now. And that's kind of just something that we keep seeing happening, and that kind of goes into GM crops and all, which we're not going to get into because we kind of already have talked about that, but that's just something that we really have to be conscious of. So what this means to the average consumer is that chemical additives used to bolster plant production have a horrible impact on our bodies and on the environment. So the collapse of ecosystems and continued pollution of natural resources will severely diminish the ability for future generations to procure uncontaminated food and water resources.